Hello and good morning. My name is Dean Bonner and I'm the Associate Survey Director and Research Fellow with the PPIC, with the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome to our virtual program today, featuring our latest PPIC Statewide Survey on Californians and their government. Today's event is sponsored with funding from the PPIC Corporate Circle and the PPIC Donor Circle. The survey itself was supported with funding from the R.J. and Frances F. Miller Foundation and the James Irvine Foundation, and we thank them for their support. For today's program, my colleague, Rachel Lawler, will walk you through some of the takeaways and answer questions, take you through the key findings from the survey, and then we will discuss some of our main takeaways and answer questions from the audience. But before I introduce my colleague, I have a couple of housekeeping items. As a public charity, PPIC does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. And if you have a question about the survey, please send an email to the address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And if you could please include your name and organization along with your question, that would be great. I'd like to now welcome my colleague and survey analyst, Rachel Lawler, to begin the presentation.
Thanks so much, Dean, and thank all of you. I would like to thank all of you for joining us today for this briefing and for your interest in this work. Before we begin, I would also like to acknowledge my co-authors of this report, which include Dean, who you just heard from, as well as Survey Director Mark Baldassari and Survey Analyst Deja Thomas. I would also like to acknowledge our funders, the R.J. and Frances F. Miller Foundation and the James Irvine Foundation, because without their support, this survey series wouldn't be possible. So give me just a moment here. I'm going to share my screen with all of you. Okay, hopefully you can all see that now. So as Dean mentioned, the statewide survey and the Californians and their government series has, this is our 25th anniversary, and this particular survey series has been examining the public's opinions on state and national issues since 1999. This series covers a wide range of policy perceptions, attitudes, and policy preferences. And for those of you who might be joining us for the first time and are unfamiliar with the PPIC statewide survey, its mission is to provide timely, relevant, nonpartisan data on political, social, and economic opinions, which we then hope will be used to inform and improve state policymaking, raise awareness, as well as encourage discussion. And in the past 25 years, PPIC has provided a voice for over 400,000 Californians on more than 200 general issue specific and regional surveys. This particular survey was conducted online from January 13th through the 20th using the Ipsos Knowledge Panel, and the interviews were conducted in either English or Spanish according to the respondents' preferences. Our sample includes 1,539 California adults, and of that total sample, we have identified 1,050 of those respondents as likely voters. The margin of error is 3.5% for all adults and 4.2% for likely voters. So to start off, we're going to set the scene by taking a look at what Californians say are the top issues that they want Governor Newsom and the legislature to work on in 2023. These findings are based on an open-ended question where respondents typed in their own answers and really stand out above the rest. The first is the combined category of jobs, the economy, and inflation at 23%. And the second is homelessness at 20%. And when you take these two categories together, we find that more than 4 in 10 adults are focused on one of these two issues. So I think that really says a lot about Californians' primary concerns and priorities for the upcoming year. Likely voters are slightly more likely to emphasize homelessness over economic issues, but it's still the same story overall in terms of their top two priorities. We find about 1 in 5 across partisan groups mention economic issues, but Democrats are more likely than Republicans and independents to cite homelessness. These are the top 2 issues across the regions of the state, as well as demographic groups. We also find another 6% naming the environment, pollution, and climate change as the top issue, while an equal 6% say housing costs and affordability are tops. And so these 4 issues are actually the only issues that received more than 5% of mentions overall. And the shares mentioning the environment is highest among Democrats, while Asian Americans and San Francisco Bay Area residents more often cite housing costs. And another foundational question that we've been asking and tracking for quite some time at PPIC, you can see on the chart there that it goes all the way back to the start of the survey series in 1999. That question is whether the state is going in the right or wrong direction. And as has been the case for the past several surveys, we find that Californians are divided on this, with 49% saying right direction and 49% saying wrong direction. Outlook does vary by party, with overwhelming shares of Democrats being optimistic, while most Republicans and independents are pessimistic. And across regions, about 6 in 10 residents in Los Angeles and the Bay Area think things are headed in the right direction, while about 6 in 10 in the Central Valley and Inland Empire think things are going in the wrong direction. And then down south in Orange and San Diego counties, residents are a little bit more divided, with 47% saying right direction and 52% saying wrong direction. And we also find that majorities of Asian Americans and Latinos are optimistic, while most whites are pessimistic and African Americans are divided. Those who are a little bit older, so age 55 plus, tend to think things are going in the wrong direction, while younger adults are a little bit more optimistic about the state. And then finally, most college graduates think California is going in the right direction, compared to fewer than half of those with less formal education. And digging a little bit deeper into Californians' views on economic issues, which you'll remember is their top priority for state leaders, this is another question that we've been asking for the duration of this survey series, and it's whether California will experience good or bad economic times during the next 12 months. And as we've seen, inflation has cooled off a little bit, but there's still a lot of uncertainty looming. So we find 2 in 3 adults actually expect bad economic times, while 32% expect good times. And these negative views are higher than at any time during the past 2 years, but they are actually quite similar to the 68% we found at the end of 2020, when we were still in kind of the thick of the pandemic. This economic pessimism that we see is widespread. We find majorities across parties, regions, as well as demographic groups expecting bad times. The one exception is with Democrats. They're a little bit more divided, so 50% of them expect good times and 47% expect bad times. And although I don't have a chart of it in this presentation, I wanted to mention that we asked whether or not California is in an economic recession. And 62% of adults believe that it is, and most think that it is a moderate recession rather than a mild or severe one. And again, this sentiment is widespread, with majorities across partisan lines, demographics, and regions saying that California is in a recession. And although inflation has begun to ease up a bit, we find that 6 in 10 Californians say that recent price increases have caused them financial hardship in their household. And it includes 3 in 10 who say that it has caused them a serious financial hardship. And the shares saying that they experienced hardship were higher last September at 71%. So I do think that reflects the fact that prices have been coming down a bit in the past few months, although they absolutely remain high compared to recent years. And if we look at how people are faring across the state, we find that hardship is felt most among residents in the Inland Empire and least among those in the San Francisco Bay Area. And among racial ethnic groups, Latinos and African Americans are much more likely than whites and Asian Americans to say their household has experienced hardship. And perhaps unsurprisingly, as you can see in the chart, lower income Californians are much more likely than those with more moderate to high incomes to say that they've experienced financial hardship. And they are the most likely across all of the demographic groups that we capture to say that it has been a serious hardship. Again, you can see there in the chart that half of them say, half in this group say that they have faced a serious hardship due to price increases. And very quickly, I wanted to mention a couple other findings related to economic concerns. The first being that 30% of Californians are concerned that they or someone in their family will lose their job in the next year, while 45% are concerned about having enough money to pay their rent or mortgage. And these are two areas, again, where we find that lower income residents are more concerned about these things than others. So, kind of to wrap up on this topic, there is a substantial amount of negative feelings and expectations about the economic health of the state in the next year or so. And these views are widespread, but lower income residents are often feeling these negative impacts of the current economic situation more than other Californians. So, turning now to homelessness and housing affordability, which we're not only both were in the top 4 issues that Californians want addressed this year, but they're also 2 issues that are inextricably linked. So when asked how much of a problem homelessness is in their part of the state, 70% of adults and 76% of likely voters say it is a big problem. And views were similar among all adults last September, but they were a little bit lower among likely voters. So just 70% said it was a big problem a few months ago. And like the economy, this is another area where we find broad agreement. Solid majorities across partisan, demographic, and regional groups say it's a big problem. And the shares with this opinion are highest among African Americans at 83%, as well as Republicans at 79%. And interestingly, Californians are equally likely to say that housing affordability is a big problem. And 70% of adults and 74% of likely voters say this. They say it's a big problem in their part of the state. Similar shares held this view last March when we asked the question. And we also find majorities across regions as well as partisan and demographic groups saying that housing affordability is a big problem. And African Americans at 86% and San Francisco Bay Area residents are at 80% are the most likely to say this. And with an overwhelming majority of residents saying that housing affordability is a big problem, 45%, so just slightly less than half, say that their housing costs are making them seriously consider moving out of the area where they live now. And 34 of that 45% are saying that they would actually move out of the state. And very quickly, this is another question I don't have a chart for, but I wanted to mention that in a separate question, we found nearly 9 in 10 adults and likely voters saying that they're at least somewhat concerned that housing costs will prevent the younger generation in their family from buying a home in the part of the state where they live, with more than 6 in 10 saying that they're very concerned about this. And this is another area where concern is pretty much universal. It's widespread across all of the groups that we capture. So I think it's definitely a critically important issue for our state leaders to take a hard look at, especially given the population decline that California has seen in the past couple of years. So before we move on to a different topic, I wanted to quickly go back to the issue of homelessness and whether or not it has, people perceive it to be increasing or decreasing across the state. And we find overwhelming majorities of adults and likely voters saying that the presence of homeless people in their community has increased in the last year. Well, 1 in 4 say it stayed the same, and very few people say it has decreased. So the share noting an increase has risen from November 2019 when we first asked this question. At that time, it was 58% saying that it has increased. And today, strong majorities across all partisan and demographic groups, as well as regions, say that the presence of homeless people has increased. So this issue really isn't limited to certain pockets or groups of within the state, and really very few people see it as having improved during the last year. So that's probably one of several reasons so many residents have prioritized it as one of the top 2 issues they want our leaders to work on this year. And in early January, Governor Newsom released a $297 billion spending plan, and he also announced that there was an estimated $22.5 billion state budget shortfall. This shortfall represents a sharp decline in California's fiscal situation since last January. At that time, there was an estimated $97.5 billion budget surplus. However, despite this shortfall, only 34% of adults and 38% of likely voters say the state budget situation is a big problem. And roughly half say it's somewhat of a problem, and about 1 in 7 don't think it's a problem at all. Interestingly, similar shares held this view 1 year ago when we had that nearly $100 billion surplus. And today, 23% of Democrats say the budget situation is a big problem, compared to 2 in 3 Republicans and about 1 in 3 independents. And before we get into some specific elements of the budget proposal, I wanted to highlight that we included a very brief summary of the budget plan in our survey, and you can find that question text in our full report on the PPIC website. But asked whether Californians favor or oppose the budget plan as it was presented to them, 6 in 10 say they favor the proposal, 35% oppose it, and a small 5% either haven't heard about the budget or just don't know how to answer. And majorities across regions and demographic groups, as well as across partisan groups, favor the governor's budget, with the one exception of Republicans. Among them, 69% are opposed. So now if we look at some of the finer details of the proposal, which you can see on this slide, starting with the governor's plan to refrain from accessing the $22.4 billion in the state's rainy day fund to partially address the current shortfall. And we find that an overwhelming majority of adults and likely voters think it is a good idea, and only about 1/4 say that this is a bad idea. And there is agreement across partisan groups that this is a good idea, but Democrats and independents are much more likely than Republicans to hold this view. And we also find that strong majorities across regions and all demographic groups think it's a good idea. So not tapping into this rainy day fund to help bridge that gap is definitely a popular approach. The budget proposal also continues to sustain promised investments that, among other things, expand transitional kindergarten, sustain universal school meals, support the state's homelessness strategy, as well as expand healthcare access, which does include expanding Medi-Cal to all eligible Californians, regardless of their immigration status. And solid majorities say that this part of the plan is a good idea. Partisans, though, are sharply divided. So we find that overwhelming shares of Democrats and solid majorities of independents say it's a good idea, while 3 in 4 Republicans think it is a bad idea. And we also find that majorities across regions and demographic groups think that keeping the funding going for these programs is a good idea. And finally, the proposal also calls for spending cuts to areas such as transportation, housing programs, workforce training, and efforts to fight climate change. And Californians are divided on these cuts. About half of adults and likely voters say the cuts are a good idea, while about half think they are a bad idea. And interestingly, Democrats and Republicans are similarly divided in their opinions, while 55% of Republicans think that the cuts are a bad idea. Among racial ethnic groups, roughly half of Asian Americans and Latinos believe the cuts are a good idea, while slim majorities of African Americans and whites say they're a bad idea. And men and women also feel a little bit differently. 53% of men think they're a good idea compared to just 43% of women. So we're now going to change course a little bit and take a look at some national issues and our federal leaders. But before we get into the findings on this particular chart, I just wanted to offer a little bit of additional context about the state of the nation. namely that 2/3 of adults and likely voters think things in the US are headed in the wrong direction, while just 3 in 10 say they are going in the right direction. So with that in mind, fewer than half of Californians say they have a great deal or a good amount of confidence in President Biden to make the right decisions for the country's future, while a majority of 55% say they have just some or no confidence at all. And confidence was higher in January 2021 at the start of Biden's term. At that time, 58% had at least a good amount of confidence. And today, Democrats, perhaps unsurprisingly, are the most likely across all groups to express a great deal of confidence, while 3 in 4 Republicans say that they have no confidence at all. And African Americans are the most likely among the racial ethnic groups to have a great deal of confidence, and the shares with this opinion increases as Californians get older. So I personally find it very interesting that in a very politically blue state like California, a majority of residents lack a significant amount of confidence in a Democratic president, and particularly with the added factor that we're approaching another presidential election next year. And when asked if President Biden and Congress will be able to work together and accomplish a lot this year, overwhelming majorities of adults and likely voters say no. Views on this topic have completely flipped from January 2021, right after Biden was sworn in. At that time, 69% of adults and 64% of likely voters said they would be able to work together. But I don't find this change necessarily surprising, given we now have a divided government with Republicans controlling the House of Representatives. What I do find a little bit surprising is that even a year ago, when Democrats controlled the White House, as well as both houses of Congress, 59% of adults did not think they would be able to work together. So this kind of downward trend in optimism, I think, reflects perhaps the hopelessness that people had as Biden took office versus the reality of what they see as having been accomplished or maybe not having been accomplished in the past 2 years. And today we find that majorities across partisan and demographic groups are pessimistic, as are majorities across regions. So I'm going to finish up in these next 2 slides by taking a look at approval ratings of state and elected officials, state and federal elected officials, starting with Governor Newsom, who recently won re-election to his 2nd term. Just under 6 in 10 adults and likely voters approve of the job he's doing, while roughly 4 in 10 disapprove. And his approval has been above 50% since the beginning of January in 2020. And perhaps unsurprisingly, partisans are sharply divided in their assessments, while about half or more across regions and demographic groups approve of the governor. Californians are split when it comes to the state legislature, with about half of adults and likely voters approving and half disapproving. Again, partisans are deeply divided, with most independents disapproving. And regionally, half or fewer approve, with the exception of 6 in 10 in Los Angeles who approve. Excuse me. We also find that 53% of adults and 56% of likely voters approve of the job Joe Biden is doing as president, and his approval numbers are actually identical to what we found last February. To give you an idea of how that compares to his national approval, 41% of adults nationwide approve of Biden, according to a January Gallup poll that was released, I believe, last week. So Californians are generally more approving of the president than are adults across the nation. Views, again, in California are deeply divided along party lines, and about half or more across most demographic groups approve. There are 2 exceptions here, 45% of whites and 41% of adults with some college education approve of Biden's performance. And moving to Congress, we find that approval is far lower compared to presidential approval, with just 27% of adults and 22% of likely voters approving, while overwhelming majorities disapprove. Approval is similar to a year ago, and it's actually never gotten above 50% since we started asking this question in October 2005. Today, majorities across regions, as well as partisan and demographic groups, disapprove of Congress. And views among Californians are similar to the national sentiment. According to that same Gallup poll that I mentioned a moment ago, 22% of adults nationwide approve of Congress and 73% disapprove. And finally, around 6 in 10 adults and likely voters disapprove of the US Supreme Court, while fewer than 4 in 10 express approval. Approval was much higher the last time that we asked this question, which was back in January 2017. And at that time, 57% of adults and 53% of likely voters approved. Partisans are once again divided, with majorities of Democrats and independents disapproving, while about 6 in 10 Republicans approve of the court. And majorities across most demographic groups and regions disapprove. The one exception is 49% of adults with a high school education only. And as I'm sure many of you witnessed on TV or online, or perhaps read about it after the fact, California's representative from the 20th Congressional District, Republican Kevin McCarthy, won his election bid for Speaker of the House after a long 5-day, 15-ballot floor fight. And despite being from California, strong majorities of adults and likely voters have an unfavorable impression of him, while slightly more than a quarter have favorable views. And we find that majorities across partisan and demographic groups, as well as regions, hold unfavorable impressions, with the exception of people in his own party. So 56% of Republicans hold favorable views. So now, in addition to the findings shared today, I wanted to highlight some other key areas covered by the survey that we did not cover in the webinar. And those are perceptions of crime and policing, views of the state and local tax system, perceived trust in state and federal government, opinions of the US Supreme Court, preferences for state spending, as well as attitudes towards political parties. So I highly encourage everyone to go check out not only our full report, but also our crosstabs and our time trend documents that we have. Those are all available on the PPIC website. So at this point, that concludes the presentation slides, but I would like to remind everyone in the audience to submit any questions or comments to the email listed on your screen. That's ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And as Dean mentioned earlier, please remember to include your name and the organization that you're with. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it back off to Dean.
Hi, Rachel. If you could stop sharing your slides, maybe. There we go. Yep. Perfect. Thanks so much. That was a really great presentation. There's so much stuff that we have in this survey, so it was really great to hear about a lot of that. And so I'll begin my thoughts with something that I think plays a sizable role in the way that people answer questions in our surveys, the way they perceive government, the way they perceive policies that are being placed before voters, and that is political trust. I think it's, as a political scientist, we know that this not only impacts approval and election choices, but also kind of overall views. And there are a number of things that stick out to me when I look at the 6 questions in total that we asked about political trust. At the state level, it's notable that while the share saying they can trust the state government to do what is right just about always or most of the time is just a point off the all-time high for that answer, there are still a majority who say the state government can only be trusted only some or none of the time. And so that's noteworthy that we have a majority holding this view. Also, Californians are as likely today as they've ever been to say the government is run by a few big interests looking out for themselves rather than for the benefits of all the people. And these views of state government are very widely held, with majorities across most parties, regions, and demographic groups saying that they can trust state government only some of the time or none of the time, with just a few exceptions. Those exceptions being Democrats, residents in Los Angeles, as well as college graduates. And when we look at the responses to those thinking that state government is run by a few big interests, we find that majorities across all of those groups hold this view. And in fact, strong majorities across regions and demographic groups hold that view. And so these questions are really noteworthy because as we think about how they view the governor or how they view the budget, this is what's underlaying a lot of those opinions. And notably, while perceptions of trust at the state level are low, they are even more pessimistic about the federal government. Just 1 in 3 Californians say they can trust the federal government to do what is right, while a strong majority think that the federal government can only be trusted some or none of the time. And the share saying that the federal government is run by a few big interests is 15 points higher than the comparable question at the state level. And so this kind of goes along with this idea that Californians are much more pessimistic about the federal level than at the state level. And similar to the state government, these views are widely held with majorities across all of these partisan, regional, and demographic groups saying that government can't be trusted and that they're run by a few big interests. Tied to this is the fact that many Californians also think that there is a lot of waste in this federal and state government, with 45% saying this about the state government and 55% saying that the federal government wastes a lot of the money we pay in taxes. So once again, this kind of is attached to the idea of how you're going to feel about the budget. If you think that a lot of money is wasted, then perhaps you don't want to, feel favorable about these budget ideas or proposals. And it's worth noting that for all of these questions, we have time trend data dating back to the late 1990s. And for the most part, trust has been low throughout this period. It's not like this is something new. This is the same as when we look at Americans nationwide. We've seen an erosion of trust really since the 70s or 80s at the federal level when you look at national comparisons as well. And so that's a really big part of this. And there's something else that I think is kind of linked to trust. It's the idea that along with low trust, views of political parties are also not great. We find that about half of Californians have a favorable view of the Democratic Party, and fewer than 1 in 4 have a favorable view of the Republican Party. These views have been pretty consistent over the last decade in periodic surveys, with Democratic favorability hovering around 50% for the most part, and 1 in 3 or fewer holding favorable views of the Republican Party during this time. And so this isn't something new. These views are pretty widely held, although as you might expect, partisan views of their own party are a little bit higher, with Democrats feeling better about Democrats and Republicans feeling better about Republicans, but independents have less than favorable views of both of the parties. And tied to this is the idea of whether or not Californians think that the major political parties in the United States do an adequate job in representing the people of California or of the United States. And we find that that nearly 7 in 10 Californians say that a third party is needed because these parties do such a poor job. Notably, the share saying that a third party is needed has increased 17 points since a decade ago. So while these favorable views have been low, the share who actually say, you know what, we need a third party here to address some of these issues has increased substantially compared to a decade ago. And we also asked some questions of independent voters about whether or not, have they ever been registered in a party in the past, if they would join a party, if it represented their views in the future. And for the most part, among independents, there isn't a whole lot of desire to join a third party. And most are saying that, you know what, when it comes to when the rubber meets the road, they don't lean towards the Republican Party or lean towards the Democratic Party. We're finding about half are saying that they lean towards neither party. As political scientists, we kind of call this what we call pure independence. And so it's notable that even if there were a third party, these independents aren't necessarily going to jump on it as a way to go forward. And so with that, I want to make sure we leave enough time for our Q&A. And as a reminder, if you have any questions, please send them to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. All righty, and so let's go ahead and start with this first question. On the state budget, we are in a very different place now compared to a year ago, going from a large surplus last year to a large deficit this year, from like 100 billion in surplus last year to about 22 billion in shortfall this year. How do you view the fact that the share of Californians saying the state budget is a big problem, only about a third, is basically unchanged from a year ago?
That's a great question. That's something that initially surprised me when we first got our data back from this survey. But I think one thing that is important to consider is the timing of our fieldwork for this survey. So our survey was conducted between January 13th and 20th, and the proposed budget was released only 3 days before that, so on January 10th. That doesn't give a ton of time for people to kind of learn about it, digest it, particularly those that took the survey in the first couple days of fieldwork. So I definitely would be interested in asking this question again in May after the May revise is released. I think then we'll have a better understanding of the exact numbers in terms of the shortfall, and people will have been much more exposed to the news about the shortfall by that time. I also think that there's the fact that the budget doesn't contain, at least at this point, any new general taxes. I think that plays a role, because if it did contain that type of, a tax increase like that, people would be maybe more clued in. It's going to impact them directly, and a lot of times that's when people really kind of start to take notice of something like an issue. So I think a combination of those things has contributed to those stable results that we see. And like I said, I'm definitely interested to see if that changes once the time passes and people become more aware of it, and once the revise is released.
Yeah.
Dean, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think from like a technical standpoint, it's important to note that this question about the problem seriousness of the budget was asked before we go into the budget details. So people are answering this question before they're asked about the actual question about the budget and about some of these cuts or surplus or whatnot. And so that's very important to note. I was actually looking at this for a potential blog, and it's interesting that the largest change from year to year actually came among independents, who were much less likely to call the budget a big problem this year. And so I think that's notable. And also the share of folks who say they were impacted by price increases a lot were much more likely last year to say that the budget situation was a big problem. So perhaps as inflation has cooled, they've kind of related that somewhat with the budget as well. And so I think that's all I have for that. Let's see. Question number 2 that we have here is, given how closely linked the California and U.S. economies are, what do you make of the fact that Californians' economic outlook for the U.S. is much gloomier than for the state? It's a great question. I think, to start off, I would say that, some of this is probably, partisan, in the sense that, it's a Democratic blue state, so maybe they're feeling more optimistic about it. There's also the fact that, we have the looming debt ceiling that's kind of, we've already hit it, but the Congress needs to address it. There's also the fact that California has kind of reserves that, have been talked about over the last few years as we've kind of become more solidly grounded economically. And so I think maybe there's a bunch of that. But I did kind of, look at this and, when we look at who's more positive about the state, Democrats are much more positive about the state than the federal economy, than the national economy, as well as younger folks seem to be a little bit more optimistic. And so,
yeah,
do you have anything to add?
I think that's spot on, Dean. Definitely, in California, we have the Democratic supermajority in the legislature. We have a Democratic governor, and so it makes sense that they would be much more aligned and much, more optimistic about how the state is going versus a divided government at the federal level. So I think that's definitely a big component of that.
Sure enough. While we maybe wait for another question to come in, I was just curious, is there anything that really struck you as unexpected about the survey findings? I know this is a question we get a lot from the media, so I'll put my journalism hat on and ask this of you.
Yeah, I definitely, I think in every survey, there's at least one thing that surprises me. One that comes to mind this time around is something I mentioned in the presentation, and that was the similar numbers that we recorded between Democrats and Republicans when it comes to the proposed cuts in the budget plan. Just thinking back to that slide, the plan calls for spending cuts to some different areas like transportation, housing, climate change efforts, and workforce training is the other one. And we find that about half of Democrats and half of Republicans saying that these cuts are a good idea, and half saying in both parties saying that they're a bad idea. And not really another time that comes to mind easily where we kind of see that type of similarity between parties. So it doesn't happen really all that often. And I think the key kind of here is in the areas that are going to experience cuts. Some of them, like say housing programs and climate change efforts, those would be traditionally more problematic, for Democrats in terms of them being or experiencing monetary cuts. And we also know from our economic well-being survey in November that Republicans are actually very much on board with workforce training programs. So this might be an area where Republicans don't want to see cuts in the budget. So the result is kind of this, I don't know if you want to call it like a stalemate, but you have both parties divided about the cuts in the budget, but for different reasons. So I found that to be interesting. As I said, this isn't something we see all that often.
Yeah. And for me, I think, similarly to that question, what struck me as unexpected was the responses about using the rainy day fund to partially close the shortfall. It was notable that Republicans were much less likely than Democrats or independents to say that they would want to use the rainy day fund. And it just struck me because, California, that Republicans have always been supportive of kind of increasing the rainy day fund and building it up. And so the fact that, nearly 8 in 10 Democrats said that they thought it was a good idea to not use the rainy day fund compared to just half of Republicans said that. And potentially they think, perhaps the thinking is that, we have it, we should use it. But I would have anticipated maybe they're being more likely to say, well, let's make cuts as opposed to use the rainy day fund. And so that's, it's kind of interesting, but I think, regardless, we'll have to wait and see what happens in the May revise to see kind of where we go from here. And at this point, I'm not seeing any more questions, and we're near the end of our program. But I would like to thank you, Rachel, for not only this great presentation, but for all the great work as we've been working on this survey since December. It seems like ages ago when we first started this work. I would also like to thank our funders. And finally, thanks to all of you for joining us online. If you pre-registered for this event, later today you will receive a survey. We would appreciate you taking a couple minutes to respond to let us know how we did. And we love surveys, and so we definitely want to hear from you. And with that, please everyone be safe and have a great afternoon. Take care.